Hey, welcome students. It's Mr. Bruin again with your digital photography class. Today we're going to talk about portrait photography and some techniques for taking great pictures of people. Here on the screen we have two portraits. One was taken painted a long time ago. It was painted by a man named Albrecht Dürer in 1517. And on the right is a photograph taken of Alex, taken in 2008. Now both are portraits. And for just a moment I want you to pause the video and I want you to think about these two portraits and write down a list of the similarities between these two portraits. Even though they're separated by 500 years, there's quite a few similarities in the composition layout of the portrait. So pause the video and make a list of what you think are similarities. Okay, we're back. Let's think about this a little bit. When I look at these two portraits, I see a lot of similarities. And there's differences too, but there's a lot of similarities. Both photographs are what we would call maybe a head and shoulder, head and torso portrait. Both the eyes, the positioning of the eyes in both portraits are pretty similar. They're about at the top third of the portrait. Both people are turned just slightly away from the camera or the portrait artist, but yet they're looking directly at us. And the lighting is coming from the side of the face a little bit, and the backgrounds, there's not a lot of detail in the backgrounds. They're pretty plain. Alright, let's go ahead and take a look now what we'll call the rules of traditional portraiture. There are 4 rules for traditional portraits, and they are: number 1, when we take a traditional portrait photo, we should usually try to angle the shoulders so that they're not square to the camera, but they're turned slightly, as you saw in our previous examples. Another rule of portraiture is that the primary light source should be at an angle towards the face. It shouldn't be directly in front of the person or directly behind them, above or below, but instead the primary light source should be coming in towards the subject from an angle about 45 degrees. The background should be blurry or soft. It shouldn't have a lot of detail. It shouldn't be full of a lot of distracting elements. And by blurring it with in our camera, that's one way to remove distracting backgrounds. Number 4, and the final rule, is that the subject, the person, should fill the frame. We should get up close to the person and really fill the entire picture with just that person. Here's an example of a very famous portrait. You probably know it. It's a picture of Mona Lisa painted in 1507. And isn't it interesting that this portrait actually follows these 4 rules of traditional portraiture? In fact, maybe this picture helped to establish these rules. Mona Lisa's shoulders are angled. There's a primary light source coming from above and to the left, down towards her face. It's at about a 45-degree angle. There's a background, but it's somewhat blurry and out of focus, and so it doesn't attract a lot of attention. And the subject matter, Mona Lisa, fills the frame. This is a great example of the 4 rules of traditional portraiture. So how do we get this effect with our camera? In photographic portraits, there's a few things we need to do. First of all, before you start pushing the shutter and taking pictures, you want to position your subject. So again, place the person's shoulders at an angle to the camera. And before you even do that, figure out where your light source is and make sure that the person is not looking directly into the light or light from behind them. It should be off to an angle about 45 degrees. So position your subject. Next, get really close. Okay? Fill the frame with your subject matter, with your person. And by doing this, you're actually helping to create that blurry background, because the closer you are to your subject, what we create a shorter depth of field in our focus. We'll get to that later on in the course, what that means. And by doing that, you're creating a blurry background. So getting close both fills the frame and helps us create a blurry background. Next, if you have a camera that has different modes, try the portrait mode, and that should help you take a good photograph or portrait as well. And finally, in order to help us with some of these settings like a blurry background and things like that, if you have a camera that has manual setting, override, you can also set your camera to take a picture with a large aperture setting, meaning the aperture opening in the lens is large, and you know that because it'll have a small number. The larger the aperture, the smaller the setting, the f-stop setting. So for example, f2.8 would be a large aperture setting. Here's an example of a great portrait, a young lady. Again, all 4 rules are followed here. Shoulders at an angle, blurry background, light source from an angle, and we fill the frame with the entire subject matter. It's a great portrait. Alright, when we take portraits with the camera, there's other things we have to think about as well. Things like lens choice. You can have different settings of your lens. Even on a point-and-shoot camera, you can either zoom in on the subject by having a longer telephoto lens, or you can pull away by using a wide-angle lens. And a telephoto lens, when the lens is long and sticks out a long ways from the camera, tends to create a really flat portrait or effect on the face, as you can see from this top picture of Matt here. The face looks fairly flat, there's not a lot of contour to it. That's because it was taken with a long telephoto lens. A wide-angle lens, in our second image here of Matt, actually creates distortion in the picture. See how Matt's nose looks a lot bigger than it actually is? That's because it was taken with a wide-angle lens. Okay? An extreme wide-angle lens, such as this picture of Sean, the third picture, really creates a lot of distortion. It also lets us see a lot of the environment that the person is sitting in, which is great for environmental portraiture, which we're going to get to a little later in this unit. But it also creates distortion. See how big his hand is in relationship to the rest of his body? That's a distortion from the camera lens. So really the best choice for traditional portrait photography is to have a moderate telephoto lens. What I mean by that is a slight telephoto setting on the lens length, but not a really long zoomed out lens setting. But a really moderate one will do the best for your photographs, like the picture of Alex here. There's no distortion, the picture looks good. Another thing to consider in portraiture with a camera is the lighting. Lighting has a huge effect on the look of the picture. For most traditional photography, portrait photography, we want to have soft, diffused light. This picture here by Adrielle, beautiful lighting. It's soft, it's diffused. What do I mean by that? There's no harsh shadows. One best way to control that is by the time of day in which you take your portrait photography. I don't know if you knew this, but the morning and the late evening are the best times to take portraits. Middle of the day, the lighting is too harsh. So sometime before 10 a.m. or sometime after 3 or 4 p.m. is usually best. If it's a cloudy day, that's also good because the clouds help diffuse the light. And if necessary, you can even use a little flash, what's called fill flash, to kind of fill in the shadowy areas of the face and make a nice looking portrait. However, our second picture here at the bottom has more harsh lighting, and in some instances people might want this effect for their portrait photography. Harsh lighting, usually in the middle of the day, without any clouds in the sky and things like that, will create a very high contrast picture. You can see it's very light on the right side of her face and quite a bit darker on the left. This is creating high contrast. And you can see the difference between these two photographs, all created by the type of lighting being used. So we're going to have a lab with this photo assignment, and in this lab I want you to first of all take 5 portraits, at least 5 portraits. You can take more if you want, and in each of those portraits I want you to demonstrate the 4 rules of traditional portraiture. If you can't remember what those are, go back to the beginning of the video and review that information. Each picture should demonstrate all 4 rules. Then I want you to take some more portraits, or at least one, in which you create a distortion, a distorted portrait look by using an extreme wide-angle lens. Some of those examples I showed you earlier. When you're done, I want you to take your best portraits and post them into the Moodle assignment that you're in right now, that you're viewing this video from. Post your portraits there, and then I want you to choose what you consider your best portrait and post it to your Moodle blog. and put some comments with it. Tell us about why it's your favorite, some of the techniques you use, and how you use the 4 rules of traditional portraiture on that picture. Okay, that's it for this week's lab assignment, and hope you learned a little bit about how to take a great portrait. Go out and take some great pictures, and I'll see you soon.